there's a generation walking among us right now who raised themselves. Not metaphorically, not poetically, literally. They came home from school to empty houses, fixed their own snacks, did their own homework, put themselves to bed, and never once thought to complain about it, because no one was listening anyway. They didn't get participation trophies. They didn't get helicopter parents. They got a house key, a TV with 3 channels, and the quiet understanding that the world wasn't going to slow down for them. They grew up skeptical, self-sufficient, and a little bit invisible. And somehow, they became the most psychologically underestimated generation in modern history. Today, we're going deep into the mind of Generation X. And I promise you, whether you are Gen X, were raised by Gen X, or have never given them a second thought, what you're about to learn will fundamentally change how you see them, and maybe how you see yourself. Welcome back. If you're new here, this channel is where we take the invisible forces shaping human behavior and drag them into the light. Today's invisible force? An entire generation, born roughly between 1965 and 1980, sandwiched between the massive cultural footprint of the baby boomers and the endlessly discussed millennials, often called the forgotten generation. And yet, their psychological fingerprints are on almost everything you interact with in modern life. So let's ask the question almost no one is asking. What actually made Generation X the way they are? And what does their psychology reveal about the human capacity to adapt, survive, and quietly thrive without anyone ever noticing? Before we get into the psychology, let's clear something up. Generation X is not just a demographic bracket, it's a psychological fingerprint, and it was carved by very specific historical and social conditions that no other generation has experienced in exactly the same way. Think about the world these kids were born into. The late 1960s through the 1970s were a period of profound social rupture. Everything that the previous generation had been told was stable and trustworthy, government, marriage, religion, institutions, was visibly cracking. The Vietnam War shattered public faith in government authority. Watergate confirmed that leaders could lie, manipulate, and betray on the largest possible stage. The oil crisis introduced economic anxiety into everyday life. And the sexual revolution, while liberating in many ways, also dramatically accelerated the breakdown of the nuclear family. The US divorce rate more than doubled between 1960 and 1980. Let that sink in. Gen X children didn't just read about family instability in textbooks, they lived it. Many of them were the children those divorces produced. They watched marriages dissolve in real time, shuttled between households, navigating adult emotional terrain with absolutely no map. And then there were the ones whose parents stayed together but weren't really there. Because this was also the era of the dual-income household becoming standard, both parents working full-time, children coming home to empty houses. This group got a now famous label, the latchkey generation. Research from as early as 1982 began documenting what this looked like on the ground. Children as young as 6 or 7 managing hours of unsupervised time every single day after school. Not because their parents didn't care, but because economic reality demanded it. Because the culture hadn't yet built adequate childcare infrastructure, because nobody had quite thought through what it would mean for child development. And here's what's psychologically fascinating about that. The latchkey experience didn't break Generation X, it forged them. It created a cohort of humans who learned earlier than almost any generation before them that they were fundamentally responsible for themselves. That is the bedrock of Gen X psychology, and everything else we're going to talk about today grows from that foundation. Let's talk about what it actually does to a developing mind to grow up primarily responsible for yourself. In developmental psychology, we understand that children need what's called a secure base, a reliable, responsive caregiver who helps them regulate their emotions and teaches them that the world is fundamentally safe. When that secure base is consistently present, children develop what psychologists call secure attachment. They learn to trust, to connect, to ask for help when they need it. But many Gen X children, through no fault of their own and no fault of their parents, grew up without consistent access to that secure base. Not because they were abused or neglected in the dramatic sense, but because the adults around them were overwhelmed, distracted, or simply absent. Because the cultural message of the time was essentially, kids are resilient, they'll figure it out. And so, Gen X did something remarkable. They became their own secure base. They developed what psychologists call autonomous self-regulation, the ability to manage their own emotional states without depending on external support. They learned to sit with discomfort without immediately seeking relief. They learned to solve problems independently before even considering asking for help. They learned to need less. This is why if you know a Gen X person well, you've probably noticed something. They are deeply uncomfortable being seen as needy. Asking for help can feel, to many Gen Xers, almost like a moral failure. Not because they're cold, but because they trained themselves over years of solitary afternoons that self-sufficiency wasn't just preferable, it was survival. There's a concept in behavioral psychology called self-efficacy, your belief in your ability to accomplish things through your own effort. Gen X, as a cohort, developed extraordinarily high self-efficacy, not because someone told them they could do anything, but because they actually had to do everything themselves regularly from a young age. And here's the nuance that most generational analysis misses entirely. This self-reliance isn't emotional coldness. It's a form of psychological strength that was earned through genuinely difficult circumstances. Many Gen Xers care deeply. They just express that care through doing, through showing up, through solving problems, not through processing feelings out loud. Understanding this distinction changes everything about how we interpret Gen X behavior in relationships, workplaces, and parenting. Now let's talk about one of the most defining traits of Gen X, their legendary skepticism. Gen X is skeptical, cynical even. They've been called jaded, disillusioned, too cool to care. And while that can look like apathy from the outside, what's actually happening psychologically is far more sophisticated. Here's the key. Gen X came of age during an unprecedented collapse of institutional trust. They watched Watergate unfold as current events. They watched the Cold War create a low-grade, constant anxiety about nuclear annihilation that was never fully addressed or processed. They came of age just as the AIDS crisis was erupting and watched authorities fumble the response catastrophically. They entered the job market during economic recessions and were told to work hard and pay their dues, only to watch companies downsize loyal employees with zero remorse. Trust for Gen X was not a given. It was something you earned, and something that institutions had repeatedly demonstrated they were not entitled to. Psychologically, this produced a generation with extraordinarily well-calibrated epistemic vigilance, a term from cognitive science describing the capacity to evaluate the reliability of information and the credibility of sources. Gen Xers learned young to question what they were told, to look for the gap between what was promised and what was delivered, to maintain a healthy distance from authority rather than defer to it automatically. And here's what's important. This is not pathology. This is adaptation. Researchers studying what's called defensive pessimism, the strategy of anticipating negative outcomes in order to prepare more effectively, have found it to be a genuinely effective coping mechanism. It's not defeatism, it's a form of emotional intelligence that protects you from being blindsided. Gen X didn't become cynical because they're broken. They became skeptical because the evidence, consistently and repeatedly, told them that blind faith was dangerous. This is why Gen X employees resist corporate buzzwords, why Gen X consumers distrust advertising, why Gen X voters maintain distance from political messiahs of any stripe. It's not negativity, it's pattern recognition built on experience. And honestly, in a world increasingly filled with misinformation, manufactured outrage, and performative authenticity, the Gen X instinct to step back and say, "I'll believe it when I see it," might be the most psychologically healthy posture available. We have to talk about the dark humor, because it's not an accident, it's psychology in action. Gen X humor is famously dry, self-depreciating, sardonic. Think early The Simpsons, think Clerks, think Reality Bites, think the entire aesthetic of 90s alternative culture, a generation essentially rolling its eyes at earnestness. Why? Because humor, particularly dark or ironic humor, is what psychologists call a mature defense mechanism. It's one of the most adaptive ways that humans process pain, anxiety, and situations that feel out of their control. Gen X grew up with a lot that felt out of their control. Divorced families they didn't choose. Economic anxiety they couldn't fix. A nuclear threat they were too young to defuse. A cultural moment that was moving faster than anyone could process. Humor was how they metabolized it. Not by pretending the hard things weren't hard, but by refusing to be destroyed by them, by finding the absurdity in the wound, by saying, essentially, yes, this is terrible, and also, can we acknowledge how ridiculous it is? This is emotional sophistication disguised as irreverence, and it's one of the reasons Gen X humor has aged so remarkably well, because it wasn't built on optimism that could shatter. It was built on clear-eyed acknowledgement of reality, wrapped in wit. Here's something that gets almost no attention in mainstream generational discourse. Generation X may be the most technologically adaptable generation in history. Not because they were born into technology, they weren't. They grew up without computers, without the internet, without smartphones. They learned to navigate card catalogs and rotary phones and physical encyclopedias. And then, mid-life, mid-career, the entire infrastructure of modern work and communication transformed completely. And Gen X adopted, completely, without the fanfare. They learned the internet, they learned social media, they learned smartphones. They became digital translators, fluent in both the analog world they were born into and the digital world they adopted as adults. Psychologically, this is extraordinary. Research on cognitive flexibility, the brain's ability to shift strategies and adapt to changing conditions, consistently shows that individuals who grew up navigating ambiguous, unpredictable environments develop higher baseline adaptability. Gen X's latchkey childhood, all those hours of figuring things out alone, without instruction manuals, without adults to ask, literally trained their brains for adaptive problem solving. They had to change the channel manually. Now they're managing cloud infrastructure. And they did it without complaining about it on social media because they were too busy actually doing it. Now I want to address something that requires real nuance. Because Gen X's emotional restraint, their tendency towards stoicism, their discomfort with vulnerability, their resistance to asking for help, is both a strength and a wound. And we do the generation a disservice if we only celebrate it. The same conditioning that produced resilience and self-sufficiency also, for many Gen Xers, produced difficulty with emotional intimacy, an unconscious belief that needing others is weakness, a tendency to cope alone when connection would actually serve them better. This is not a character flaw. It's the psychological cost of a childhood where emotional needs consistently went unmet, not out of malice, but out of circumstance. So if you know a Gen Xer in your family, your workplace, your life, maybe the most powerful thing you can do is simply notice them, not with pity or diagnosis, but with genuine curiosity. Because the people who raised themselves into resilience often never quite believed that someone else might choose to show up for them. And that belief, once shifted, changes everything. If this video opened something up for you, share it with someone who needs to see it. And if you're Gen X yourself, leave a comment below. Tell me one thing about how you grew up that shaped who you became. I read every single one. Like this video if it brought something real to the surface. Subscribe if you want more content that takes human behavior seriously. And I'll see you in the next one.